Well, we'd like to welcome everybody to another Sunday afternoon class from the Brigham Young University or BYU Library Family History Center. We're happy to bring these weekly broadcasts. Let's get started. We've asked a question about ancestors working on railroads, so we're going to have to learn a little bit more about railroads, and we're also going to need to know quite a bit more about how we go into finding these records. There are two main reasons for doing railroad records because it could be helpful in documenting an ancestral family. This is a whole huge source of records that is virtually untapped. I almost never run into genealogical researchers who say, "Oh, I really know a lot about railroad records." Well, that's one of the problems. That's like saying, "Oh, I've never looked at U.S. Census records and I don't know if they're helpful." The information that you can get from these is as much or more than you can from than a lot of other records. Understanding when and where the rail lines were constructed helps in determining whether two people you have known could have known each other or been related. We have the rule that when the baby was born, the mother was there, and there are some other rules out there. Now there are 17 of these rules, and some of them talk about how far and how distant a person can be before it's unreasonable to think that they had some association, or that if there was an association and you have that proved or substantiated association, then how did that happen? How did that come about? And whether or not you think you have the right person and the right amount of information to support that may depend entirely upon the length of time it took to travel between two locations. And if you go back before 1830, then you are starting to get into this question pretty much that we'll talk about here in just a few minutes. Railroad employment records open up a world of research opportunities. There's just a lot of places to look. Here's the difference. The difference here is railroad records are not generally in the larger online websites. They're not considered, they're not obviously considered to be genealogical records. They don't appear to have been targeted by the larger genealogical on-site websites such as Family Search and Ancestry, etc. But they are full of information and they are very valuable. So the key here is you have to move out of your online large website circle that's confining you to these records that are there in those large websites and start to look outside at records that may take a little more effort or a lot more effort to access and to locate, but can be extremely valuable. So let's go back to the history of this so you can get the dates and the times and when this began to have an effect on society. I've already mentioned the date of 1830. 1830 is kind of the generalized date accepted for the beginning of the real Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution actually started many years before that, at least 100 years or more. And the reason for it was that it took mechanization was occurring with the power looms for weaving cloth in England. That's kind of the study of where all of this technology began to grow. By 1830, the biggest factor of everything that was going was the limits on transportation. And steam engines became the issue, which began to be constructed kind of in the abstract in the late 1700s. But by 1830, they were mechanized. They were put on machines that would work. And the date of the first full-scale working railway steam locomotive was in the United Kingdom in 1804 by Richard Trevithick. This was Britain, and Britain is generally considered to be England is generally the place where the very first type of mechanization occurred. This was the one that's called the number one is the George Stephenson locomotive, and it was the first one to carry passengers on a public railway. Railways first were developed in mines to haul very heavy loads of ore out of the mines to carry it to various locations. Once they began to be obvious to people that they could move a lot of other things besides coal, and so they began moving people. And here's the date, getting closer to the date that we consider to be the fundamental date is in 1825. And this is after 1825. It's in 1831. And this is the DeWitt Clinton. And this is the one I remember from school as saying that this was the first railroad. And you can see here, it's got all the components. It's got a track. It's got wheels. There's a steam engine, which at the time is blowing out a huge column of smoke. And then there's a freight car, and there are some passenger cars. These passenger cars bear a remarkable resemblance to stagecoaches, but that's what they had. And so this is the way that it looked. Okay, we're going to jump massively. Let's just say that beginning then, there was this explosion of railroads around the world. As soon as England began developing more railroads between more cities and began to see the advantages of carrying passengers at 20 or 30 miles an hour instead of 4 or 5 miles an hour, they began to move people very rapidly between the cities. And other countries, obviously, when they went to England, it didn't take too long before there were people in the United States and other parts of the world who saw the value of railroads, and there was a scramble to develop railroads. Then, in the middle of the Civil War, it became almost painful. Well, it was very painfully obvious that the west coast of the United States was disconnected from the east coast of the United States by weeks. And people could immediately see the advantage of being able to have a railroad cross the entire country. As far as Utah is concerned, for example, where we're here in Provo, Utah, 1869 is a little bit later to get the entire transcontinental railroad completed. But by the time of 1862, railroads had gotten to the part we call Utah today, and people no longer had to cross the plains in wagons or handcarts or whatever else. And so the pioneer era is the time between the first pioneers to Utah in 1847 and the ending of that at the time the railroads arrived. Kind of an example here is what happened is that, for example, my great grandfather and his wife settled in a little tiny town in northern Arizona called Joseph City today. And that occurred in 1887. And it was in 1882 when the railroad got there. So they were actually pioneers and separated from the country and isolated in a little pioneer settlement out in the flat of the Colorado Plateau for only a few years. And actually, the children of my uncles, great uncles there, were railroad employees. They helped build the railroad too once they needed some cash. Now we're going to another jump. By 1917, there were 1,500 U.S. railroads. That means companies, 1,500 different railroad companies. And there was 254,000 miles of railroad, and they employed 1.8 million people. And so railroads were the largest single employer in the nation. Everybody around where the railroads were worked either directly or indirectly or benefited indirectly from the railroad. So understanding the railroads and looking for railroad records is one of the best ways to begin understanding the flow of people, when they went, how they went, and when they went to the different places around the country. Railroad employment would peak around 1920 with about 2.1 million workers. And that was also the peak in railroad mileage. What we're looking at here is a policy of life insurance for locomotive engineers. So if you were an engineer, you could buy this insurance and get paid if you happen to smash into something or fall off your train or whatever. And according to the 1920 census, the U.S. population was 106,021,537 people, and 2.1 million of those worked for the railroads. Okay, so this is kind of and I'm going to go through this a little bit and making some comments as we go down. These are job descriptions, and the reason why this is important is, let's say you're looking at U.S. Census records, and one of the columns in the 1900s in the U.S. censuses was for occupations. And so when you're looking at an occupation and it says one of these things, you may get a different idea of what they're talking about if you don't understand the relationship between the jobs and the railroads. It also helps when you're doing work on the census records to look at the occupation and then look at the occupation surrounding. If the record says your guy was a farmer, everybody else around there could be farmers, except there might be some that owned stores and there might be some that sold other things. There might be some other stores out there too, if there were small towns or big towns. But on the other hand, if you get into some of these occupations from the railroad, which are very common, you might see something that doesn't make sense or has a different kind of association. So if a person and the people where they're living end up having several of these kinds of jobs, then it's likely that they are all working for the railroad. So we hear of engineers, firemen, person who worked putting coal in and regulating the heat. And you'll notice on the right-hand side, there's a note about the fact that it became obsolete with diesel locomotives in the 50s. Brakemen. This is probably one of the most dangerous jobs. And then it became automated and became a supervisory job. Conductor, if you know or have ever ridden a train or you are interested in trains, the railway, then you would know what a conductor was. A surveyor, they went out to figure out the railroads. You can imagine the degree of involvement of surveyors as they built the Intercontinental Railroad. In other words, they built the railroad clear across the United States and managed to have one come from the west and one come from the east, and they weren't that far off. And that shows you what the surveyors could do. Flagmen, signals became automated and technical over time, but there are all sorts of information. You can see as the first letters, for instance, conductors are still conductors, surveyors are now civil engineers, flagmen are now signal maintainers. They're people who maintain all the signals. You might want to think about railroads. In my experience, in my lifetime, I didn't particularly have any real close relationship with railroads. I was fascinated with them. I loved railroads. I loved learning about railroads. I had all sorts of interest in them, but I never really had much experience riding railroads or being involved with the railroads themselves. That changed when I became a teenager. My first big experience with railroads was as a Boy Scout, and we rode the railroad from Phoenix, Arizona, up to Colorado to the Air Force Academy up there, where they held a national jamboree. And that was really the first time that I can remember having ridden on a railroad. Well, that changed a whole lot as I got older because I lived in Argentina for a couple of years and we rode trains constantly because they were one of the major ways of going from one place to another in Argentina. And since then, we've had some rather extensive use of railroads in Europe and other places around the world. So it's just interesting that that railroads are what they are today. I mean, just recently we rode a train from Denver, Colorado to Moab, Utah, and that was a nice experience. Telegraphers, obviously that became obsolete. Yard masters, they still operate the yards. They still are there. They're still doing that job. So here's kind of definitions of those and what they did that are kind of connected. You might see some of those names might be sort of arcane and they might be difficult. But if you recognize any of these different terms, that's going to put you on the track of knowing that your person that you're searching for was probably connected with the railroad. And if they were connected, there are railroad records, and those records are probably available someplace that will give you a lot more information about that person. So there's all these. The railcar mechanics are called the carmen. They do the repairs, maintenance and track repair, welders and inspectors and dispatchers that schedule, train master, the operation and manages the crews. Then we have a lot of people who were in other parts jobs, workers in the safety rules, roadway worker in charge for the RWIC was the person responsible for the rules. And in the way of jobs, especially during the early years, from my what I've read and what I've seen, I would guess that working on the railroad was about as dangerous as any job in the United States. It was always a matter of things happening, and the machinery as around was extremely dangerous. It took quite a while before safety concerns became a large enough concern or an important enough concern that they made some efforts to decrease the amount of risk in running and supervising these machines. So you can see here freight and ticket clerks and porters. Porters were a tremendously important part of the history of the African American community. This was one of the first major job categories that was opened, albeit slowly at first and with a lot of opposition. But porters became associated with African Americans in a sense. And I am doing some research about the movement of the formerly enslaved people out of the South during the Jim Crow eras when they were being heavily persecuted. A lot of, let's say, into the millions of people moved out of the South into the large cities. And one of the ways that that was facilitated was through the jobs that were available to African Americans for porters. And so there's a direct relationship here between the railroads and the exodus from the South by African Americans. Cooks, passenger trains. When you ride a train, like in Europe, for example, and you compare that to taking an airplane flight in the United States, you wonder why passenger comfort is so low on the level of airlines and is so high on the level of trains. It's the economy there. It's tremendously cheaper for a train to carry passengers than it is for an airplane to carry passengers. And so the tendency with airplanes, of course, is to jam as many passengers on, and on railroads, it's to now it's trying to attract people to actually ride the railroads. So you can see here some other job lists. Here's a suggestion. We have on familysearch.org right now a somewhat newer, the last couple of years, that's been developing, and now it's in the main search menu. So if you go to familysearch.org and look under the search menu, which is the main menu for looking for records, you'll find the second item is a full text search. It hasn't quite reached any kind of large numbers compared to the total number of records on Family Search, but they're actually converting or processing millions of records a day, making them available to be the handwriting to be recognized or processed into text files, and then the search being for every word. So one of the things you can do with full text search is, and looking on Family Search right now, is you can just put in a railroad and you'll get every record that's been processed that deals with a railroad. Then you can use the search fields to put in a name, put in place, put in a dates. And remarkably, then, if your person comes up with any kind of association with a railroad, you'll find that information rather quickly. We have other videos and other instructions on the BYU Library Family History YouTube channel. We're starting to put up more videos on full text search as it evolves. And so you can get more information about making those searches. But just bear in mind that this is a way to quickly find a list of people who are working on the railroad. And if you look here on the census record, this happens to be for in Alabama, in Jefferson County, Alabama, and Bessemer City. And you'll see how these railroad people kind of congregate in one area, especially if they're all laborers and families with the laborers. And here's kind of a little bit of a blow up. I know this isn't a very good view of it, but it's kind of out of focus because of the pixel is. Another record. This is just an example of railroad operation record. So you see over here on the right side of the yellow portions in yellow, these records were found using full text search. So using that, I found these records rather quickly for records for people dealing with the railroad. You can also look for a specific railroad, like in this is the Pennsylvania R&R, and you could then put in the names and vary those names, and you would be able to focus in on the individuals or the people who were involved in this. So to begin your research for railroad information, if you know the specific railroad and the time period and that your ancestor worked, you can then target your search to the correct railroad repository. If you don't have this information, if you don't know the railroad that they worked for, or you have just kind of a sketchy idea of the railroad, that, oh yeah, they may have worked on the railroad kind of idea, then you need to go back to the basic question about locating people and genealogically locating people, and that is to look for the location. So you find out where the person lived, and there has, newspapers, census records, all the different kinds of records can help you focus on where the people lived, and then simply go out and do searches for the records. And when I say do a search, I would suggest this, that if you're not familiar with it now, it's time to get involved with the AI search engines. You've got, as I kind of mentioned before we got started, Google Gemini has outreach with a greater amount of information and innovation than anyone now. And is kind of what happened with Google was a few years ago, a couple of years ago, when this was starting up, Google wasn't even in the game, it seemed like. And there were all these articles written back and forth and videos. And they'd say, well, Google isn't doing much in genealogy yet, and they're really getting behind everybody else. Well, kind of unknown to the general AI community was that in the background, Google was basically buying up all the technology and all the companies that they needed. And so beginning about a year ago, they came out with their Gemini and their products. And then rapidly, and I would say extremely rapidly in the last 2 weeks or 3 weeks, began to just completely dominate the whole field. And so now there's the change in the responses online is that everybody says, well, you can look at all this like Chat GPT and that, but the main reason that Google is now so far ahead for the time being, and it could change tomorrow, obviously, is that it's now giving you all the sources. So when you're starting to look for the sources of information for your ancestors' railway and where these railroads were, that's the kinds of questions you can ask Gemini and get the answers just straight out. And they'll have links out there. If it doesn't show up with links, just ask for sources, and you will have a list of all the sources you need for your area of research and give you out to all the repositories. So this is kind of in a sense, when I show these records, I'm saying this is a place you could look, and this is something that would be found by Gemini, or if you just want to use something else, it's Copilot, which would be the Microsoft one.
Question that Melanie asked, can you use AI to ask how a person might have gotten from where they live to, say, a certain town or area in Ontario, Canada by railroad?
Sure, absolutely. That's the kind of question you would ask AI. If you qualify it, sometimes when you're asking questions like that, it's a good idea to explain what you're really looking for. So a question like that would be, my family lived in Ontario, California, in Ontario, in this location in a town in Ontario. What railroad were there? What railroads were there in the area that would have been available for this person to use in that time year? In what year? In 1920, what railroads would be available for use by my ancestor living in this town? That's the kind of question you just immediately get an answer for. Now, if there aren't any records, I mean, there's not going to be any answer. Gemini, for example, and I hate to keep going on, harping on that one, but it's the far ahead today. And so Gemini would say, I don't know all that. There doesn't seem to be any records. And so they'll just tell you. But then you can ask different questions and you may still get the answer. So how far was it from this town to the nearest railroad in 1920? That kind of thing. So if you keep asking questions, you'll keep getting information. So far, I mean, when I say we, my wife and I both are so amazed at the way we have answers and the way that it's working. So this kind of question here, I may have mentioned this and it's worth repeating. The years I spent doing Research Wiki articles for Family Search Research Wiki, which is just obviously the major source. All of the Research Wiki and all of the major stuff on family search is completely searchable by Google. The only things that aren't are restricted areas and living people. And so if you ask a question it's on Research Wiki, you get the answer, whatever answer you get, plus all the other information. It's always a source for Google. So you are not limited to the Research Wiki and its limitations. You're basically asking Google itself with its billions and billions and billions of records for an answer. And so the answers you get, and as I may have mentioned just a few minutes ago, was that I could basically go into Gemini and write a wiki article in a matter of a few minutes and have more information than is generally available in the wiki today. So here's what you can ask. So if you are wondering about the railroad board that handles retirement, disability, and survival benefits, you would simply ask Gemini or one if you want to ask. The problem with asking many of the others is you won't get the sources. They won't tell you the source. If they do the sources, unless they're changing again, somebody else jumps ahead, which could happen tomorrow. But right now, for the time being, you'll get the sources from Google and Gemini. So here's the kinds of responses you would get. So if you ask that question, what does the RRB handle? What do they do? Then you would get this kind of a response. And this is the kind of thing that you would have to know. All the things that are here, who are the records that are there? They eventually get sent to the National Archives, so you might have to look in the National Archives. They're deceased individuals and have birth, death dates, parents' names, spouses, children information, addresses, and other things. So there's lots of information here. Now, this is kind of one of the limitations, and the limitations is that some of these records are in the National Archives. That's the good news. They're there. The bad news is that the National Archives is well behind in having even appreciable percentages of their records digitized and available online. So you may, in a sense, if you're at that level of doing genealogical research, have to plan a time when you can spend a few weeks at some national archives doing research. I mean, I know people who do that, and they're involved with research at that level. Otherwise, you can then ask if, once again, back to AI and Google and Gemini, you could ask them what records are available at the National Archives in Atlanta and get that information. Now, the way I'm answering these is to understand that I wouldn't have been able to do this, to make these statements a few months ago. I mean, just a real short time ago. The technology is changing so rapidly, and what is available is, this last week, I've spent a considerable time just watching videos and trying to learn things that change. And when I go to look for a video on YouTube, for example, I will not even look for a video that's more than 2 weeks old because it won't be accurate. It won't be up to date. And so this is a changing time in information retrieval and processing. And we're going to make a lot of this stuff more available as time goes on. And even the National Archives has a fairly substantial movement to digitize their records. So things over time will become more available, even probably at a faster pace than they have in the past. Here's another library. This is the Baker Library at the Harvard Business School. This is an illustration. This is not just the fact that this one library has records for the Pennsylvania Railroad collection. This is where you're going to be able to see where these records may be kept. It's going to be likely that there are these formal and sometimes academic institutions that will have preserved and kept these records. Special collections libraries around the country are major repositories for valuable records. And it is not unusual to do research in a special collections library. One of the biggest collections of records in my particular family was about 7 feet of records that were associated with my great grandfather, Henry Tanner, that were in two libraries, the University of Utah Library and the Northern Arizona University Library. Temple University Libraries is another one. I'm just giving you examples, not an exhaustive list. This is not by any means a closed list of the records that are available. It's simply examples of where these kinds of records may be located. So when you're doing your online search and you're asking Google about the location of these records, you can say, give me other records for Pennsylvania, if you think there are. Or you can say, are there more records for the Pennsylvania, or fill in the blank, the Union Pacific or the Central, Pacific, or whatever, all these different railroads. As you know, as I mentioned earlier, there were a couple of thousand, or 1,200, I think is the number. Museums and libraries. This one happens to be in Wilmington, Delaware. Once again, it's the Pennsylvania Railroad, which is fairly large. Of course, Delaware is close to Pennsylvania. And personal papers of the officers and specialized materials like the timetables. Okay, so one of the questions I raised just a few minutes ago was locating a person, whether two people could know each other, have had a contact with each other, given the time period that they lived and the amount of railroads were available. Using England as an example, if your person lived in 1830, the fact that somebody had built a railroad in England in 1830 has absolutely nothing to do with your people being able to know each other if they lived too far apart. There just was no way that they would have been connected unless you can come up with some records or information that shows that there was in fact a connection by commerce or the Navy or someone in the armed forces or people who were involved in shipping or whatever. So those are the kinds of things that where you have to begin to understand the I'd call it micro history of the area where your families are located to make sure that you are still on base as far as whether or not all of these people could actually be your ancestors. This is Cornell University, and they have records from 1883 to 1973. It's almost 100 years of the records of the Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen. Whether or not you like unions, whether or not you are a fan of unions, or if you don't like them and you think they're terrible organizations, they still have a lot of records, and they kept lot of records about their people, about the people who belong to the union. And in a lot of cases, during different periods of time, union membership was obligatory. You couldn't have a job if you weren't a member of the union. And so their union records are still available. You can see here that this is a collection. It has 153.56 cubic feet of records. The National Archives, as you do record searching and research into the National Archives records, you'll find out that very many of the collections of records are basically in existence, and they're, I would say, on the records as being a number of cubic feet. That doesn't give you any possible idea of what you have to go through any more than my 7 feet of record says. One afternoon, my wife and I, Ann and I, spent a considerable period of time in the Northern Arizona University Library going through all of that 7 feet of records in page by page to see what was. I found a great deal of it that we were not interested in because it was available in other places. But there was a core that was really valuable information, and we got permission to photograph it. And so we got a lot of that letters preserved in our particular group of records. So here's an idea of what you could look for. The Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen was founded in 1883, and it's a protective and insurance organization. And then it merged to other railroad labor unions and formed the United Transportation Union in 1969. And this is the largest of all the brotherhoods or unions for the railroads. Here's another one, the Minnesota Historical Society. So you have the archives, you have universal special collections, and now we have historical societies and museums. All of these can have valuable records, and searching down these records is possible. And let's say the reason it is because most of these, I mean, almost uniformly, have websites and list the kinds of records that are available. So when you begin that process of doing research, you'll find that they do have those records. Okay, now here's another note. I put the URL or the address of these particular websites here, and the question usually gets asked is, do I have a handout? The answer is yes. Copies of these slides are available on the BYU Library Family History Center website, along with the videos, and also on the YouTube channel. Now there are libraries which are another one. And the reason, and this was interesting to me, that as you notice here, this is about the fourth place where we've listed Pennsylvania Railroad collections. So it's possible that the information you need may be in a variety of different archives and repositories. The word repository means where records are kept. It's a place where records were kept. So all of that's the umbrella term for archives, libraries, museums, societies, and websites. The Newberry in Chicago has a lot of interesting things that are valuable to genealogists. And this is where you're moving into some other railroad archives. Now, there are societies and historical associations that deal directly with railroads. One of the things I found, for instance, when I was an avid stamp collector for probably into my 30s, quite a few years of my life till it got really complicated, my life being complicated. So I was a very active stamp collector. And one of the things was people would collect railroad stuff. Anything associated with railroads, and stamps were one of those things that a lot of people focused on. So they were topical collections and they would collect stamps. Well, these places collect railroad. And in some cases, they have railroads. They're running a railroad. There's a couple of them in Arizona. There's at least one now running in Utah, maybe more, maybe one or two. And around the country, you'll find these historic railroads that you can ride on and go on trips on. Oh, yeah, there's one that comes here to almost down what's called Provo Canyon, which is just east of here where we live in Provo, Utah. There are scenic railroads, but in association with the railroads, they have a lot of memorabilia and they have, in some cases, extensive record collections. And what I kind of suggest here is to keep searching. And I have found, and I could go on here for probably a few hours talking about this, that almost every state has a collection of railroad records somewhere. If you just dig a little bit and make some questions and start talking, particularly to the railroad enthusiasts. Now, one railroad enthusiast that you might almost automatically find are people who are involved in model railroads. They will, in a lot of cases, have additional information about where all the information came from. They like to build their models that reflect what was in an actual railroad community area in the railroads. So a lot of research sometimes goes into these tabletop railroad displays. I know there's big ones every place around the United States. I don't know. I don't have a feel for whether or not any of the younger people are getting involved in railroad modeling. I'm, people that I know that have these extensive miniature town building things are all older. So this may be another dying area of interest, but right now they're still alive and there's still people out there running this. And when we lived down in Arizona, there was a friend of ours who had a very large backyard, probably I would guess a half an acre or more, and it was entirely done in a miniature railroad, a fantastically large miniature railroad business. So you never know what you're going to find. Okay, well, thanks for watching. Any questions now? What about researching ancestors in Canadian railroads? Same questions you'd ask, the same type of records available, whether you're doing that in England or France or Germany or Switzerland or any country that has a railroad system, Central America, Panama, Mexico, all of the Latin American countries, as I mentioned, Argentina, everybody has some railroad. And so there's people, and that's something, those are records that probably are somewhere available.
A question was asked, if your ancestor died before Social Security came into effect, how do you deal with it?
Well, okay, so it depended. If it depends. If he was a farmer and he was lived on his own farm and that was before Social Security and he died, he's going to be on land and property records and maybe he was a part of an agricultural co-op. This is an example of how you would find that. We were discussing in the context of writing the research wiki, the family search research wiki, one of the questions that came up initially was records for Utah because we had to start someplace. And so the question we were trying to get up to types of questions. So I said, well, what about co-ops? And they said, well, what are co-ops? And so I explained that they were the agriculture and co-ops of people that organized for storage and sale and everything of their products, wheat and corn and cattle and all that kind of thing. And so they said, oh, so I did some research in Utah, found 2 pages single spaced listing all the co-ops that existed in Utah. So when we get the idea that there are these kinds of records like the railroad records, we then can move into doing research that shows us we have to learn about it. In other words, you may not know zero, you may know zero about railroads right now, but if you started looking and asking, and we have this tremendous example, I mean, advantage now of being able to ask questions of the organizations like Google that can give us access and tell us where all these things are and answer the questions. So these kinds of things with these railroads, it would be interesting for you to just go in and do a Gemini search on the railroad and even ask your specific ancestors' involvement. There may be records enough online and information to supply that.
Melanie gave us further information about her question. She said the person who worked for the railroad was also a farmer in Nebraska and died in 1898 before Social Security. Any thoughts on how to do research on that?
Well, there's again, see that you've just what you've just done is formulate the question to ask. That's how you would begin the research. You just go into Gemini, and I'm suggesting that not because I love Google or anything or promoting Google and don't associated with Google in any way, but that's the tool we have today, and it may change tomorrow, maybe a different tool. But if you just say what you just said and say, how do I find this information? You may be surprised.